Thank you for coming here this afternoon. It's so great to be here in this beautiful hall. And we want to thank our co-sponsors, the Center for Contemplative Leadership. Grateful for their support and their work. And Wesley is the director of the program here, the center, I should say, not a program. And this event is being sponsored by Goldenwood. Myself, David, Kim, Amy Lee Watkins were co-founders of the organization, and our organization exists to cultivate a new vision of work. And the conversation we're going to have today is actually a really critical part of our endeavor because it gets to the really ultimate questions about the nature of reality and how is it that we begin to understand the world that we're living in. And we get kind of the rare and often unexpected combination of science and the arts coming together, even though that was by definition, the liberal arts understanding. For those of us who went undergraduate programs that had these liberal arts programs, they understood the nature of how important both the sciences and the arts were and bringing them together. And in this afternoon's conversation, we're going to be not only talking to two people who are experts in those areas, but really asking ourselves, for me, it's what is the reality that I wake up to every morning? And how do I make sense of the world that we're living in? And I think ultimately those are questions that shape the way we think about how we define work and what vision of work do we want to see passed on to the next generation. So this is an important conversation for us at Goldenwood, and we're so glad that you're here. And I want to begin. Most of you have already, you know the people who are speaking, but I want to, by way of a more formal introduction, just give you a sense of the folks here. And, if you go to Mako's website, the thing I love about it, and it gets me every time, it says slow art, and then it just stays there. And, you see your angst of, the anger of, why is this taking so much time?
But skip button at the bottom.
Okay. But I let the process take place. But yes, so Mako is a leading contemporary artist whose process-driven, refractive, slow art has been described by David Brooks, from the New York Times, as a small rebellion against the quickening of time. Fujimura's work has received critical recognition over 3 decades. Artist and critic Robert Kushner wrote about Fujimura's art and art in America in the 90s, quote, "The idea of forging a new kind of art about hope, healing, redemption, refuge, while maintaining visual sophistication and intellectual integrity is a growing movement, one which finds Mako Fujimura's work at the vanguard. His art displays an imminent abstraction, placing itself on the cusp of the real, where the mundane and intimate can be dreamed of, and the metaphysical can approach the tangible. His works are regularly exhibited in museums around the world." Our second speaker or guest here was Kerry Magruder, who is a curator in the John H. and Druza B. Cable Chair of the History of Science Collections and the Associate Professor of Bibliography, Associate Professor of the History of Science at the University of Oklahoma. And as the curator of the History of the Science Collections, his work focuses on expanding the holdings of rare materials to build on current strengths and to address emerging areas of research interest. And that's a good place to start with just the nature of your relationship and what it is that brought you together. So before we dive in too deep on some of these questions of ultimate reality, I'd love to hear just what it is that brought you in relationship with each other.
So I've had the joy and inspiration of reading Mako's work for years, and to be encouraged especially by his vision of reaching a new creation through beauty that is born from our sorrows and from our sacrifices, not apart from those, but through them. And that's been a sustaining vision for which I thank you. That resonates with me so deeply when I hear the stories of the great scientists of the past. Kepler, for example, who I have to think of while I'm in front of this organ right behind you, who really stepped out under the heavens and heard the music of the spheres in the celestial laws that are still accepted today as how galaxies revolve around galaxies. He first presented all 3 of those celestial laws in musical notation. And to him, and for us today, if we have the ears to hear, we step out under the stars and hear a cosmic dance. So that vision of the cosmic dance is something that the arts help us to recover. It helps the sciences to flourish. You have two people here who both exemplify the arts and the sciences. We're not arts and science. And one of the great stories about Mako to me is not only this vision that keeps us sustained in our wonder and our discovery, like the music of the spheres, but it's also the way his art exemplifies this integration of art and science, that the imagination makes possible for us to transcend the stale old dichotomies of the two cultures that have afflicted us for several centuries. So that happens in part because, as I think you put it in Art Is, you grew up as an artist in an environment full of scientists. It was a perfect way to put it. Yeah. Your father and then those coming in and out of the door on any given day, you were there witnessing great science in the making. And science at that level is something where you can't hide the creative dimension. It's front and center. And you got to live that. And I love the story of your father's response when you decided not to follow in his footsteps as a scientist, but to become an artist. They did.
Yeah, my father, the leading acoustic speech and hearing scientist in the world, and I grew up really not understanding who he was. He was not home often. He was in research at Tokyo University and then Bell Labs. But as I got to understand him and this conversation that I had with him about my path came as a result of him deciding to drive me to Bucknell University, which was 3 hours away, that he just said, "I will drive you," and so we spent three hours going and 3 hours coming back. And that's how I got to know my father. I didn't know him well before that, I don't think, as a person. And I started that, being in college, I was able to study sciences as well as the arts, and I felt that there was something very integral about both, especially, as you know, in liberal arts education, you start to think about the connections. And so I would take sensation perception classes and learn about all these, neurological studies and sciences. So I got to ask my father about all this. And at one of these conversations, I said, "Dad, I think I'm going to try to make it as an artist," which I knew was this crazy notion, and it didn't faze him at all. He said, "Oh, that's what I wanted to do." I wanted to be an artist. And
Did it surprise you?
It surprised me a bit. It didn't surprise me that my father would say that. When you think about it, when you look back in our journey, and I have a revamped second edition of Culture Care coming out, and I start with the story of my father that I experienced as a young child, and he had this unusual way. He was a very generous person, and anything that I try to do, he would support. I knew that, so that wasn't surprising that way. I did not know that he had this interest in becoming an artist, and I got to find out that he's always painted, and of course I knew about his creative side, and of course his research is his creative side as well. But in some ways, what was, I think, surprising was that he saw sciences, the rigor of science, as part of his art. Like, he was explaining to me, like, I cannot do what I do without that part. And when I heard that, I was like, I thought they were separate. Like I was deciding to go another route. And to him, it was not that at all. To him, it was this connected, integral experience of a scientist. And so I always say that he made my becoming an artist possible. Both of my parents, but my father particularly allowed me to think of what I do as research, as valid as any scientist doing their hard work of collecting data and coming up with theories and testing them. And going back to reality, that what you were talking about, reality that is increasingly hard to integrate. That we are disembodied because of technology. It's because of culture war. We have created these alternative realities, which is largely this reality. But when I was asking my father about sensation and perception research, he said, well, we cannot see anything without imagination. And you note this in your essay about George MacDonald, which we'll talk about. But so my mind is like, what? What do you mean we can't see anything? I see reality, and I can talk to you about this pipe organ, but that's not the case when you really delve down into the deepest realms of sensation and perception, where the brain, how the eye works and brain works. The eye is part of the brain, exposed to the world. It goes straight back into the back of the brain, where the hearing commingles with that. So it's a complex matrix of data that we take in all simultaneously, all at once. And so, people have done research on somebody who was blind, who gained sight, and they open their eyes, they can't see the world. It's overwhelming. The sensation is overwhelming. They see lights everywhere. They can't organize. We can't identify a camera. We can't identify, face. We are just totally immersed in this sensory data that we don't know what to do with. And then so my father kept on explaining to me, hearing is not just identifying sound. So that, I'm going to stop soon because I'm just going to keep going on this open door. But he said in the 70s, in early data acoustics research at Bell Labs, he pushed against the grain of this idea that you can segment data and put it back together and that it will sound like a human voice. He said that's not how we should do this. Because he felt that human understanding of what we hear is integrated in our brains. We have the capacity to imagine reality in a cohesive way. And to him, that was what art was about. He was trying to get inside of that.
I get so excited when I see an example of science that is done in a non-reductionistic mode. And so it is a real honor that Mako has entrusted to us the care of Osamu Fujimura's papers and archive. And that's an exciting project for us now. But in your book, Art Is, you do talk about the distinction between seeing with the eye and through the eye. Right. And that's so illuminating for any art. But would you say that that's continuous with what you're just describing about what you learned from your father?
Absolutely. And, when we talk about golden wood, we try to bring all these separate realms into one kind of stream. Like when we go to work, in any field, let's say you're a plumber, and you're integrating your knowledge into somatic knowledge of repairing. What seems like a simple act that can be explained in a YouTube it's not so simple when you do it, right? So I talk about in my other book about recipe, difference between recipe knowledge and actual making the omelet knowledge. It doesn't matter how many times you read the recipe. It doesn't matter how, you have all the pans that Jacques Pepin has, used. The omelet doesn't come out like what the master chef will make. So what is the difference, right? That reality. And in that gap, you start to realize, you start to identify that what we think we know is not necessarily what is true about knowledge, right? So you end up questioning, is any knowledge that we read in, we learn in schools true? And how do we test it? Mm-hmm. Right? And this is at the basis of scientific research. Now, I wish I can say that all scientific researchers have gone through the rigorous process of questioning this. And according to my father, that's not true. Mm-hmm. Even the best scientists have blind spots that makes them do certain researches, for instance, that are segmented and creates these data points that are supposed to recreate reality when they're actually segmenting reality, especially in reductivist assumptions. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, I think both of you, what I think makes your work, combines your work, is there is this kind of, I would say, like imaginative realism.
Yes.
And oftentimes those two words are, they're juxtaposed versus, and in some ways you're going against the positivism, you're going against reductionism. And can you speak about, particularly with respect to your writings, how was it that George MacDonald just helped you kind of hone that sense, that imaginative realism all the more, and that exudes everything you do, Mako. So I'd love for you to just talk about that.
Oh, thank you so much. I think you can open George MacDonald at random and you'll find that he grasped these issues deeply and profoundly and spoke against the prevailing positivist and reductionist climate of his age. He did so expertly and with depth. But I can't resist, if you don't mind, giving the example of Galileo to build on what you just said. Galileo became an international celebrity overnight after using the telescope to discover mountains on Jupiter, mountains on the moon and 4 satellites revolving around Jupiter, and unsuspected numbers of stars. The first edition of that book will be stored not far from your father's papers so that they can be in conversation. Wow. The OU copy was presented by Galileo to a poet in the Medici court. Galileo could recite poetry like Dante by heart. There's never been a split. But what's often misunderstood is even in those observational discoveries, like the mountains on the moon, that was not made with the optics of the telescope. It was made because Galileo had the same training as professional artists of the day. The Florentine culture and in wider Tuscany taught young students in their teen years the techniques of perspective drawing. And then they could become an engineer like Galileo if for their senior project they made a 3-dimensional design, or they could go on to become an architect or an artist or a sculptor. Galileo's best friends were in those professions. Chugoli, one of the leading artists of his generation, referred to Galileo as his master in perspective drawing. And when you see how Galileo worked through all those, the kinds of drawings he could do, mastering light and shadow, then when the telescope became available, he could interpret the shifting patterns of light and shadow on the surface of the moon and say, there's mountains there. And friends sympathetic to him who looked through his telescope, who had not had that artistic training, could not see the mountains. other people, even hostile witnesses who had that training, could look through his telescope and say, yeah, there are mountains there. It was not the optics, but the artistic training of Galileo's eyes that made possible even the discoveries that we naively think are just going out and looking through a telescope. So art and the sciences are integrated on many levels, but starting with the basic perceptual level. So what a tragedy when our reductionist filters obscure that kind of nature of the sciences from our consideration. This is the kind of thing MacDonald understood.
And George MacDonald influenced C.S. Lewis and Gerald Tolkien. I mean, that was the group, and Lewis, when MacDonald passed away, felt he was a different person because his friend George wasn't there.
Yes.
Talk a little bit about their relationship.
So, if Lewis, C.S. Lewis, as I'm sure you know, was a philosopher before he was a literary professor at Cambridge, trained philosopher and an atheist, and very much affected by the trauma of World War I. So consider him as one of the wartime poets and wartime literary figures. And his writing eventually fused the imagination and reason in a response to that kind of horrific trauma that generation experienced in the trenches. But when Lewis was in this atheist situation, he said that it was as though he had two hemispheres of his mind that he could not connect together. One was the atheistic philosophy that he believed was true. The other were all the stories that he loved and that made life tolerable and meaningful. And how could he ever bring them into unity? And when he was in that phase, he picked up Phantastes, which is MacDonald's first fantasy for adults, written in the 1850s. And he read that book, and without being able to articulate what had happened, it wasn't didactic knowledge or information, still less any kind of argument. He called it a baptism of his imagination. Mm-hmm. And that began to dissipate the fog of reductionist analytical thinking and open his mind and heart to begin to converse together. That eventually led to discussions with Tolkien and others where he was eventually converted.
Yeah, I wanted to ask that because I think most people think of imagination, first of all, as something that is apart from reason. They think of it as fantasy that you create through your imagine. You know, you say you're imagining things, right? So that's how we exile that word. But what happened when Lewis was journeying in his darkness, he realized that his imagination was already baptized by some other magic, right? What he would call deeper magic. And that's where artists have this very important role to provide a kind of stewardship, leadership in the world, because we have been immersed and trained in a way, despite people not encouraging this, to continue to activate our imagination, to see things in reality that are magical or meaningful. Even the darkness, darkness is not dark to thee, Psalm 139. There's something about an artist's vision that allows that artist to stay within that reality of trauma, darkness, to create something meaningful out of that experience. And I never really thought about until my father passed away, actually, that my imagination was fueled by his ways of looking at data, stubbornly looking at minutia of reality to me, and yet to him, that was activating his imagination to create a world in which truth was truth, rather than this perhaps synthetic, artificial intelligence. And so his research, the data that you own now at Oklahoma University, history of science, is analog data that he gained in 60s or 70s, which probably will never be replicated again. And it's just amazing to think of my father, and I was there with him as a teenager, working some of these spectrograph modules and running these machines, helping him to gather data. But what I remember, and this goes back to your question, what I remember are these patterns of voice data. You know, these needles moving up and down and then creating these patterns. And so many times I was in my studio and I'm looking at the cascading flow of my pigments, mineral pigments, very complex way that they will flow, or gold, or any kind of these prismatic materials. And I see the same data. And I feel like deeply connected at that moment to my father, obviously, but that in a sense that this scientific imagination and the stubbornness to stick to the details, which I don't have, is what allows me to stay with the patterns and follow those patterns and to discover something new in them, which I have been told that my art is uniquely, is like a portal that these random flow will not produce, because I have been attuned to pay attention to those things.
When you speak, I mean, there's this behind your words, there is this real faith assumption that things make sense, even though you might not. And certainly that is characteristic of your writing. You weave these things together and you're kind of like, what's he talking about? You know, a little bit of nature, then philosophy, and then my own life, personal life. And kind of underneath that is this kind of sense, it all fits together. And in the discrepancies of the difference is where, and you're trying to harmonize that, and you realize, okay, that's what he's trying to communicate in some ways, this underlying unity. And that sense of the imagination giving you access to things that are more real than what is visible. I think that's often the place where people get hung up, because as you said, that co-opting of that word imagination almost is synonymous with not being real. And what you guys are articulating in this kind of imaginative realism is, no, it's actually more important for us to understand these invisible realities than the ones that we tend to focus on. And so can you just, and I think to some that, like that interdependence between imagination and science, I think we don't hear that at all in the larger culture today. We never hear that they need each other, but the way you guys talk is actually you can't do one without the other. So can you articulate that interdependence of imagination and science and, yeah.
I do love your articulation, Mako, in the book of the principle of interdependence and relationality, which is at the heart of nature and of all grand science. So George MacDonald is one of those who insisted that every grand discovery in the natural sciences was born in wonder and required the imagination to apprehend before the scientific reason can come along and comprehend it. And otherwise, we're just working in trivialities, puzzle solving, learning more and more about less and less. So I think it is a bit of a tragedy in our culture that allows us to perpetuate these reductionist, flat, shallow views of the nature of science, in that we are cut off from a knowledge of our past. If we don't know someone's story, do we know them? If we don't know our own stories, how well do we understand ourselves? This is an obvious reason why we need the history of art, the history of music. But science is a pervasive part of our culture. And why do we not give space in our lives to reflect on a history of science that integrates culture and science? As soon as we take a glass elevator above the city and see the lights, we see patterns we couldn't see from the sidewalk. And the same thing is true for the actual nature of scientific practice. If we can take the glass elevator up of the history of science and hear stories like Kepler or Galileo or George MacDonald, we begin to see that imagination is in the very fabric of science. And without imagination, science perishes. Without imagination, creative science is at risk. It's not the kind of thing that can be tested or put in a textbook. And the great scientists have always been able to look beyond the textbook or beyond the equations, beyond the data, to connect with the reality behind it. And that connecting with a deeper level of reality is an imaginative act. And it makes me think, as you were talking about, as an artist, becoming attuned to that level of reality. I was thinking of a famous interview Albert Einstein did in the Saturday Evening Post, of all places, where he said, I'm a musician. I think musically. And if I hadn't been a scientist, I would have been a violinist. And he described his scientific work as trying to hear the music being played in the distance by some unknown musician. There's that trying to tune our souls, our whole selves, to the musical order or the poetic order behind all things, because it does turn out to be musical in nature or poetic in nature. And then to come back around to your writing style, I think that's a gift to the church. Art is, like poetry, a work that will help us to pause. Mako has talked about slow art, and this is a slow book to be read. Don't read it informationally. Read it as an invitation to become attentive to the experience of what it is to be creative. And then it's through works like this, works like MacDonald, that help us to baptize our own imaginations and stand in the position of the artist who is doing her or his best to hear that music off in the distance.
So I have a chapter in Art is on interdependence, and the reason I have it is, when you start out with this chaotic reality of being born into the world with fantastic mixture, complements of sensory data, and you learn to harness those into informational reality and be able to communicate, what is a chair, and without thinking, we draw conclusions. But that part of reducing data can easily lead to creating easier way of navigating the world by creating false binaries. Contraries, or however you want to call it. It's an easier way to identify and sometimes demonize the other. And what artists are constantly doing without being aware of this is creating this complex prismatic reality of interdependence in a painting on stage. If you go to any jazz concert, you will see interdependence at work in fantastic ways. On stage, they are creating a new reality that can only be created at that moment with these particular musicians, and they are doing it in a way that not only opens up reality in a bigger sense, but they're creating beauty as part of that. And we need this imagination in our public lives, in spheres of politics, in spheres of leadership, in business. We cannot keep going the way we have been going. And we have actually trained our young people to not see complexity, to be in an environment where it's safe, perhaps, but the world, is like Aslan. He's good, but it's not. He's also dangerous, right? So we have to find goodness built into this fantastic complexity, which is overwhelming, intimidating. But I think what my father did well was to stay within that complexity, and that's partly because he loved music. I have this story of a teenager. When you're a teenager, you don't pay attention to your father at all, right? And you're kind of like dismissive, embarrassed by your father. So I come home, and my father is with his Bell Labs buddies, and they're playing music, but it just sounds horrible. My father decided to start a quartet. And he couldn't find a viola player, so he improvised his violin to become a viola, and he started playing. I know. It sounded horrible. And I'm upstairs in my room, like, what is going on? Well, now I tell this story, and my heart is filled with gratitude. It's that impossibility, this complexity. My father was he decided to start a quartet of scientists. Like who does that? And who improvises a violin to become a viola? And dares to play it? Like who does this? My father is that person. And I love him for it, because, I sometimes wish I had that kind of sense of playfulness and adventure, and like saying, well, we don't have a viola player, okay? But I think he understood that, what is impossible, right? What is difficult to do, what typical society would not allow you to do, that you have to try anyways. It doesn't matter how old you are. He was driving around in his VW Rabbit in Ohio in his 70s, and I got into his car. He's driving around. He sticks a cassette tape into the cassette player, and I'm like, what kind of music is this? Is this Bach? Is this? No, it's like children singing in 12 different languages. And he's listening over and over, and I asked, Dad, what are you listening to? And he said, well, it's never too late to learn a language. You just have to learn to think like a child. And you have to learn these songs. And then the grammar and all that it will come after. So you just listen and listen until you hear a pattern. And I'm like, that's incredible, for a 75-year-old scientist. But I just, I thought that was kind of funny. I never really thought about it, as anything illuminating or elevating. But now I remember that, and I say, wow. I want to be like him.
That's profound. Thank you.
That exudes that sense of wonder, which does tear down those false binaries because it's either like success or failure. I think typically that scientific mindset is either it works or it doesn't versus this kind of like pre-imagination that allows you to take whatever you get and have a different filter. And I guess like when we hear stories like this, how are institutions teaching people, whether they're arts institutions or higher ed, how do we begin to help people integrate these things in a world where this is not being acknowledged or appreciated because as a society we almost take for granted, what you see is what you get, even though our larger culture is so yearning for the transcendent, so yearning for the invisible. So where are people learning this? Just intuitively or, please speak to that.
Thank you so much. I'll just mention that we do teach in our department. We have 10 faculty in a history of science department, neither history nor science. And we teach about 600 undergraduates a semester. And not all of them by any means are in the sciences. Many are pre-law or pre-journalism or in other fields. So our hope is that some sense of that science is a story will inject some creativity and help revive that in different ways. But in the MacDonald essay, which I call an essay because it's interpretive, don't read it just for information. It's like talking over a coffee in front of a fireplace. Okay, but I love Charles Darwin. If you ever come to OU, I would be happy to take out each of the 22 volumes he wrote in first edition and lay them in a room, and you will be overwhelmed by the beauty of them. He took advantage of every form of visual representation available to a 19th century author. And the breadth of interest, his interdisciplinarity is stunning. And to come into contact with this man who had the most astounding, unexpected, imaginative approach to the relationality and interdependence of life on Earth is remarkable. And then to pull out his posthumously published autobiography, where he's lamenting the damage to his brain caused by and loss of creativity that occurred over his later years. And he attributes this loss of an ability to appreciate music, art, and poetry to neglecting them. And so he writes, if I were to counsel my younger self, I would make it a rule every week to read poetry, to observe beautiful landscapes or landscape paintings, and to listen to music on a regular basis. So again, if we neglect the role of art in the formation of future scientists, we're damaging their science, not just their recreational activity.
Wow. It is so important what we are talking about here, the essence of integration of senses into knowledge. And, we are so concerned about AI, right? Because AI is going to, create these rabbit holes and we're going to fall into it and we can't get out of it. And that may be true. But the counter argument to this is that the arts fundamentally provide an antidote to not just AI, but that concern. That, what Darwin experienced, Darwin is a remarkable human being and writer. And people have said so many things about Darwinian thinking and survival of the fittest and all that, which is one line, in its one book, which he kind of agreed to put in at the last minute. Really, his post-Darwinian people.
And it came first from Herbert Spencer, not from him.
Yes, that's right. And he almost acquiesced to this reductivist vision. But his life, if you read The Ascent of Man, if you read Origin of Species, it's just exquisite writing, and you can tell he's losing his vitality as he's writing them, because he began to think, in this almost this technical, almost like how ChatGPT would write, pattern matching, right? And his mind became this almost like machine-like way, and you can tell right there what happens to our brains when we lose beauty, when we lose complexity, when we lose poetry and imagination. You can kind of trace it in his writings. And so we don't need AI to be threatened by any of this. What we need is to get back into the fundamentals of how we train our imaginations, how we create a future, in a sense that all artists are creating the future by doing what they do well. Wow. And all scientists, researchers are also creating the future, not to replicate patterns, but to see the fundamental newness in the data. So they're creating a paradigm in which something becomes a reality that we can apply to our reality. But then when you're applying that, you have to have imagination and freedom to dream about what kind of people do we want to become. Mm-hmm. And that should be the core of education.
That's right.
But we have, created this machinery of producing people who may be able to do certain tasks well, but just like Darwin, they're learning to atrophy their imagination. By the time they graduate, the data is that they not only read less. After you graduate from college, this is a liberal arts college, but that they do not engage in making.
So good.
If you trace from kindergarten to post-college, you make less and less, and not at all, actually, for a lot of people.
Well, you went to the AI discussion. I'm sure a lot of us are thinking about that, and it's interesting that the latest Gallup report on work came out. This is a report I look forward to every year because by virtue of the work that I do. And this year, and one of the key statistics I'm always looking for is the disengagement rate. What percentage of the world's population is disengaged with their work? And they announced again, it went up again another 2 percentage points, and now 78% of the world's population is disengaged with their work. And that's a staggering number, and they go and they talk about the economic ramifications of that high level of disengagement. And oftentimes you hear, and we know this, like, I hate my work, I feel like I'm a machine. And then here comes a technology that says, I can actually do your work. And we're freaking out because it's like, and we don't have the imagination to see in this time of great disruption where technology is threatening to take over jobs that we don't even want. How is it? And it's almost like why it might be good if AI takes your job, not undercutting the human toll of that, because part of the wonder and the imagination is how you go through difficult times. The generativity of your mind and your imagination to be able to take a difficult, like a genuinely difficult moment. You have to feed your family. You have to pay the bills. And so can you talk about why, again, that imagination becomes so critical, and that generativity, especially in difficult times, when your immediate senses are telling you, oh, this is so painful and stressful?
May I go back to the story of Kepler that I alluded to at the beginning, since we're in this wonderful setting for sacred music that is taught in this place. So for Kepler, as for so many, for centuries, the universe is a cathedral, and a cathedral is a musical instrument. And when we step out under the heavens, we are in a place where it is appropriate for us to learn to love. That is the task before us. And so in a time of warfare and shifting from one employer to another, his employer, Rudolf II of Prague, was forced to abdicate. He had to go on the road and flee. He moved across Austria and other parts of the German-speaking parts of Europe and seeking temporary employment and shelter. A couple of his children died from different diseases. This is all during the time that he's writing The Harmony of the Universe. His wife also passed away. His mother was put on trial for murder. He became her lawyer and acquitted her, but she liked to put these mushrooms she found in the tea, and some guests had hallucinations. So anyway, unspeakable sorrows. His pastor refused him communion because he was too sympathetic to the Calvinists, and the list goes on of the disruptive factors of his life, the tumult and chaos here on earth. And during that time, he was able to think musically and create what most historians of astronomy consider to be the most innovative document ever published in the history of astronomy. And this is The Harmony of the Universe, 1619, the first work that contains all three of his celestial laws, still accepted today. And a graduate student in music composition a few years ago at OU named Jonathan Annis worked through all the musical notation presented in this book, because he presents his laws in musical notation, not in the form you read them now in physics textbooks. Here is Kepler's Music of the Spheres, arranged for harp, flute, and oboe. But this is all Kepler. And this is the way the planets really move up there. Now, it's 15 minutes long. You can download it from my blog if you like, but the point is that Kepler saw through his sorrow, through the earthly chaos, mortality, discouragement, struggles, to the beauty that was actually real. This isn't just imagining something that's not there. This has proven to be what science still says. But what if our students studying Kepler's 3 laws in high school today, instead of seeing the graphs and the equations, could actually hear the way Kepler discovered it? Would that help our students in science and other fields graduate high school with a little bit more of that wonder intact, a little more of the imaginative ability?
So during the pandemic, I was thinking about trauma, obviously, that all of us went through. And I was thinking about my journey of being a survivor of 9/11. I lived in Ground Zero. I was under the towers when it collapsed. So it's a miracle that I'm here. And what made me go to the studio in ground zero, basically, it was blocked off. Nobody could get in. Only the residents could be there and paint, right? And I was organizing a museum show at the time, and some of the paintings came from that time, and they're called water flames, and they're about turning destructive fire into sanctifying flames. To literally using my imagination to walk into ground zero intentionally, so I could deal with trauma of my own, but so many of my neighbors, and creating a portal, hopefully for healing. And so I began to think, well, what are some other examples in art, music, and we could probably say science as well. And I was just astonished to think that, Evangelical painted during the Black Plague. C.S. Lewis and Tolkien wrote because of their wartime experience. J.G. Salinger was traumatized, absolutely traumatized by war. Came back, couldn't write, but what he wrote became Catcher in the Rye. And I kept on thinking, Hemingway, well, Shakespeare created a theater during the Black Plague. Actually created a theater in 3 levels so that the princes and the king can sit on top away from, and I'm reading Romeo and Juliet again and realize for the first time that the reason why Juliet didn't know what was happening with Romeo was because the messenger was quarantined. This is a story about the Black Plague. How it destroys our connective tissues. And I'm just thinking through, well, out of Evangelical's imagination became the Renaissance. What was going on in the minds of Michelangelo and Da Vinci, and I just had to conclude that everything that we see in Princeton Museum, we just walked into, has to be in some way in response to these dark moments, desperate moments, when they didn't have hope. And I was just at the Met talking about Vincent van Gogh, walked through a corridor filled with Matisse's jazz collages, the most beautiful, bright collages. And of course, he did that at the darkest time in his life, when he was most depressed, when the world was being shaken. He created these impossibly beautiful things. And Emanuel Lutze in Germany was painting Delaware, Washington crossing the Delaware as a German because their revolution failed. He painted this impossibly big painting, shipped it to New York to encourage us because his revolution fails, ours has not yet. What are these artists doing? They're composing music, they're making plays, they're dancing when the world is seemingly at its end. They've always done that. Is it possible that because they did that, we exist? Is it possible that out of their imagination, injected hope into the lives of ordinary people who made decisions, little decisions, every day? They could have lived in despair, but they did not, because they were encouraged by beauty or hope or a story or something that awakened their senses. Did these scientists, were their imaginations awakened by the wonderment of paintings and music that they saw, the theater that they experienced. I think it's quite possible that artists in that sense were the front line, certainly, of imagination being awakened in the world that allowed us to exist. And it would be such irresponsible thing for us today, as much as we are faced with realities of darkness and disasters and all sorts of wars, to not create, right? And to me, that means as an artist, I have to create this impossibly large paintings. And I have to continue to be faithful. And to me, that kind of thinking, flipping the darkness into light. And, my father grew up when he was 16, he lost his mother to Tokyo bombings. And he was spared from the war because he was in this research sector of that basically created weapons, but he was able to be excused from enlisting. All his cousins died in the war. And my father dared to come to US, eventually to Boston at MIT, to do his work with Noam Chomsky. And that's when I was born. If he said at that moment, in the dark days of post-war, where he had nothing and he could barely survive, that there's too much despair in the world, that I won't be able to work as a scientist, or whatever he was dreaming at the time. If he did not come to US and dare to do these innovative researches, I would not exist. So imagination literally gives birth to hope, and hope gives courage to the next generation, and we have to carry that mantle and build upon those things. And these stories matter because we forget them easily, and we have to tell them to each other, remind each other that these things are, the past is real, and it's dark, and we can't, if we were living at a time, Lewis lived or evangelical lived, we probably would just die in despair. But we need to look at these works and gain strength from them and say, and we were just, Judy and I were just at Princeton looking at some of the images, and we were saying, this is like what we need for fuel for our souls today, to go back to our studios and to go back to whatever we're doing and faithfully do our work. And then something may happen, something may open up.
Mako, thank you. That's so eloquent and moving, and gets at what I experience through your art. It moves me so deeply as your art becomes a gateway for me, ushering me into a deeper level of hope, because it grapples with the struggles and the darkness. It's pushing back the darkness. The light has dawned, but it's dawned for those who are in the darkness. I think of your art overlaying perfectly with 4 spiritual realities of incarnation, cross, resurrection, and new creation. For me, the incarnation and the way you value and treasure the materiality of your canvases, which I can't call paintings because they're sculptures of light. do not miss any opportunity to see his work. It cannot be reproduced on any digital screen or flat photograph. The light brings the refracted colors out into the space and surround one. And they surround me with a sense of the suffering common to us all, but more than that, a sense of the hope of the beauty that lies beyond. Just like Kepler heard the beauty of the music of the spheres, I feel the beauty of being known and the promise that the sorrows will all be healed when I sit in front of your paintings. And so that unites all of those four realities. I think of the very first sentence I ever heard of George MacDonald's when I was a teenager reading The Problem of Pain by C.S. Lewis. The epigraph runs something like this: "The Son of Man came not so that we need not suffer, but so that our suffering would be like his." And that's the cruciform shape of this opening up to reality. In this world, in this age, that brings pain and sorrow. And that is what, if the Word did not shrink from becoming flesh, and we are followers of the Word, the Logos, that puts us on a cruciform path also, but one that goes through that to redemption and hope. And so I thank you for that enduring vision.
Well, one more quick question, and then I want to open it up just for any questions you might have, and we'll have a short time of that, and then enjoy a reception and a book signing for those of you who'd like to have Mako sign something a bit more personal as well. But I guess one question, this is a short one. What are maybe one or two must read, listen to, or watch? If you want to expand your imagination in the ways that we've been talking about, what are your recommendations? So what must see, watch, listen, read? And then I'm actually giving you guys time to formulate some questions.
Well, you can walk into Princeton Museum and see many, many examples of that. I think reading, to me, T.S. Eliot's Four Quartets probably is a must, because that came also out of a dark time, impossibly dark time, and coming out of trauma and coming out of his own failures and loss of faith. He wrote those beautiful poems as a gift to us. I think, as I was explaining how Vincent painted one painting per day for 3 years, and the level of what he felt and how he was able to describe that world to us, is an immense gift that I'm just starting to understand. And you can find Vincent's paintings in museums around the world. But I would pick one and stand in front of them and think about what he saw and what he felt right around the time when Darwin was struggling, right around the time when all these things were happening. He was painting. A little earlier, Emily Dickinson was writing in Amherst. These are kind of my landing points.
Well, I will side with Darwin and just say that anyone involved in the sciences really needs to make space for weekly experience of the arts. paintings. And right here is the painter I encourage you to become familiar with through Art Is and your other books and see them in person. Poetry and literature and music. The first person I met who had read practically everything by George MacDonald, Hal Pendergrass, in St. Louis. I was about to set off to graduate study in the history of science in Oklahoma. And he said something along the lines of, Kerry, that's a perilous journey, immersing yourself in the writings of scientists. If you're going to survive this, he was channeling Darwin. He said, you must make room in your life to read fantastic literature. And he commended George MacDonald to me. So pick up anything by MacDonald, and perhaps your imagination, like Lewis's, will be baptized also.
Will you join me as we thank our friends Makoto Fujimura and Kerry Magruder?